So good evening or afternoon, really, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's book talk about Our Nazi and American Suburbs' Encounter with Evil. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark and Speaking Up, Confronting Hate Speech. You can learn more about both of those on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Michael Soffer and Hasia R. Mike is a history teacher at Lake Forest High School. During his tenure at Oak Park and River Forest High School, he taught Holocaust studies in a classroom that former Nazi camp guard Reinhold Kulle used to clean. His writing has appeared in publications such as The Forward, Chicago Jewish History, and the Times of Israel. This is his first book. Hasia is Professor Emerita at New York University, where she was the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History. She is the author of numerous books in the field of American Jewish history, American immigration history, and the history of American women. She has won both Guggenheim and Fulbright fellowships, and 2 of her books received the National Jewish Book Award. So you can buy Our Nazi at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to our speakers.
Okay, so welcome to everybody who's out there. In some ways, I'd love to see you, but that's not possible. And thank you, Sydney, for your wonderful introduction. And my next thank you goes to Michael, and thank you for writing this book. It really was an eye-opener. And before I ask you to sort of give us the kind of gist, and then I'm going to keep interrupting you with questions, I do want to say that I'm really impressed that with all the tremendous amount of work that a high school teacher has on his or her shoulders, far more than any of us who taught college could imagine, that you carved out this time, and I'm going to call it sacred time, to tell a story that clearly you, and parenthetically, rightly believe the public should know. So it really is so impressive and so rare. So hats off. If I was wearing a hat, I'd say hats off to you.
Thank you. And Sydney, thank you, and to the museum and everyone watching, and Professor Diner. I've said this to you a few times, but what an honor it is to be with one of the kind of deans in the field, and having read your works and studied your writing and learned so much from you. It's really a thrill to get to talk to you.
Lovely, but let's get to you. So I think, you know what, I'm going to assume that most of the people who are in the live stream have not read the book. So I wonder if you could give us a kind of summary, and then I'm going to probe on specifics.
Sure. So the book uses the story of Reinhold Kulle, who was a guard at the Gross Rosen slave labor facility for the Nazi Reich, and immigrated here, as many former Nazis did, and then spent slightly more than 2 decades working as the head custodian at Oak Park and River Forest High School. When his Nazi past was revealed, the community, as was the case in many communities when Nazis were caught, rallied to his defense. And so the book explores, through his story, how Americans reacted to and perceived Nazi hunting throughout the post-war years.
Okay, so in a way, this is not a Holocaust story, but it's a story about Americans many decades later learning about a Nazi in their midst and what that, how they reacted. But I think maybe we should backtrack a little. And can you say something about what, where he was from, what I'm going to be totally non-analytic, evil,
Yeah.
he did?
Yeah, so he has a pretty prototypical Nazi upbringing. His grows up outside of Breslau, which is a Nazi stronghold. Hitler at one point proclaims it his favorite city. His father dies when Reinhold is quite young, from succumbing to wounds that he had suffered at the end of World War One. Nazi school system, Hitler Youth, and doesn't really have a lot of possibilities for upward mobility. Ends up joining the SS, and other boys in the Hitler Youth are unwilling to do so, having heard of the atrocities that members of the SS were committing. He's completely undeterred. He's wounded on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of Russia multiple times. And then he happily accepts a transfer after he recovers to the Gross-Rosen slave labor camp in his native Silesia. There he oversaw slave labor. He was promoted multiple times. Sometimes he was stationed on the perimeter, where guards were instructed that if somebody was to escape, that they were required to shoot them. Other times, guards actually asked prisoners to force prisoners to try to escape so they could have an opportunity for live target practice. He also seems to have been involved in the evacuation of some of the subcamps, which were really brutal. They had death marches that left towards the end of the war, that left so many bodies strewn about, that the German army, the Wehrmacht, complained that there was no way for them to drive tanks. After the war, or as the Russians close in, he helps the evacuation of the entire camp, and prisoners go to Mauthausen, and he serves the Reich until the very bitter end of the war, when many others are deserting.
Okay, and in the immediate aftermath of the war, just that interim period between when the war is over and he comes to the United States, and just where was he? What was he doing?
Yeah, as terrible as the experience at Gross Rosen is for the prisoners, it's actually pretty great for him. One day, when he's on perimeter, he locks eyes with a beautiful girl from the town. They fall in love. Right, he's literally on duty at a slave labor camp when he meets his wife. Everybody, I guess, has a different love story. And they have a child at the end of the war, and he comes back from the child's birth, to evacuate prisoners, and participate in these kind of evacuations from the subcamps, which seem to have involved actually killing Jewish children who are at one of the camps. So a kind of odd juxtaposition. They have a second child in 1949, on his 28th birthday, 4 years after the war, and he's working factory jobs in Krempe, and then in a town called Lahr near the Black Forest, but kind of in the south of Germany. And so they're there from 1945 until 1957, when he and his wife decide, in a kind of typical immigrant way, that they're interested in a better life, and maybe America can provide that opportunity.
Okay, I mean, one thing that's really interesting about that story is that he was not coming from, this sort of East, Soviet occupied or Soviet dominated areas like Poland or East Germany, but he, seemed to have lived okay in the Federal Republic, and very different story than many of the DPs who were fleeing communism.
Right.
And his is a different story. Okay, well, he says, how does he end up in Oak Park?
Yeah, so he comes to the immigration office, and there's multiple pathways for Nazis to get into the United States in the post-war years. The kind of most famous is paperclip, right? So we bring in Nazi scientists, Werner von Braun, Herbert Strughold, Arthur Rudolph, right? There's a second pathway, which is from the CIA, and so there's a great book called by Eric Lichtblau about this, the Nazis Next Door. And the third pathway was really easy. You just lied.
Right.
And so Kula and many of the Nazis who come in here, many of whom are Eastern European, as you mentioned, they just lie on their visa. At this point, it was really difficult. We had technically laws that excluded them, but it was really difficult to check, and frankly, it was not a priority. And the DP Commission, I saw in the kind of archives, the National Archives, letters back and forth where they're saying, like, yeah, some Nazis are going to get in, but like we got to kind of deal with all this chaos of the post-war years. And he doesn't come in under the DP Act, but similar. But his wife seems to have had a relative, a cousin, living in Forest Park, which was at the time a heavily German suburb adjacent to the city of Chicago, and right next to Oak Park, which is this large suburb that abuts the city's west side. And so he comes there in 1957. He had another job. Now, Gross Rosen was built around a quarry. And so prisoners were enslaved there, mining essentially right in the quarry granite. Kula's first job in the United States was at a place called Suburb in Cutstone that sold granite to both residential and commercial customers. I'm assuming he didn't mention that his experience in the past.
Previous employer.
Exactly. But after a year and a half, there's an opening at the custodial staff at Oak Park High. And it was a shorter commute, probably cut his commute from about 20 minutes to 7 or 8. And he applied. He came well recommended from his boss at Suburban Cutstone, and somebody who worked in one of the local schools also seems to have known him. And so he applies and he gets the job in January of 1959.
Okay. So how does he get outed? He presumably was for years laboring in obscurity, and nobody knew his backstory. How does this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so funny. Very few. So I think there's this perception that the Nazis who are here, and the estimates are, range. Alan Ryan, who was the longtime early OSI director, estimated upwards of 10,000. It's probably fewer than that, but it's certainly in the thousands. We have this idea that they must have been hiding, but they largely don't change their names. And so, when Kula applies for a job at Oak Park River Forest High School, like many of us, when he needs to get his wife on his insurance plan, he has to prove that he's married. So he hands in his marriage license, which for him was at the camp. They got married at the camp. And it's stamped with a Reichsadler eagle at the bottom, and it lists the marriage location as the camp, and it lists him by his SS rank as Unterscharführer. He does work. He talks a little bit about, he kind of leaves out when people talk, but he mentions being a soldier. People knew he had fought. He's wound scars in his medical exam on his initial paperwork. But for the most part, nobody's really looking for Nazis. After a series of post-war trials, Nuremberg most famously, and a few others, the efforts to bring Nazis to justice quickly lose steam. The Cold War is upon us, and that takes priority. The Nazis are defeated, and it doesn't seem worth for many folks worth the energy or the effort or the money, or any of that. And there's even opposition, the Nuremberg trials are actually pretty controversial, not just in Germany, but here. The Atlantic rails against them. The Eichmann capture is very controversial. And so we don't really do much looking for Nazis through the 50s or the 60s. And then in the mid-1970s, a whistleblower from the Immigration Service comes to Elizabeth Holtzman's congressional office. She's from New York, and says, we have a list of Nazis and we're not doing anything about it. Over the next few years, Holtzman works tirelessly to take this issue seriously and creates the Office of Special Investigations. In 1979, 2 years later, they find Kula, and the way that they do that is they have a list of camp guards from the Berlin Documentary Center, and they have a list of immigrants, and they literally just go down the list. And because Kula and many of these other folks hadn't changed their name, it hits. And so the Office of Special Investigations in the fall of 1981 finds him and starts looking into his past.
How many other sort of connections did they make out of that list?
So a lot. They bring about 130 Nazis to justice in various measures throughout the kind of years that OSI was operating, and that can mean deportation or that can mean denaturalization. But they basically, they only brought cases when they were 100% sure. There were other Nazis who were caught who died, this is so far after the war, who died, or one who actually lived 1 mile from Kula. When he was caught, he worked at a train yard. He ran in front of an oncoming train. So they catch a lot. There are many other factors that prevent sometimes them from being able to bring them to a courtroom, but they caught many in that same way.
Okay, so take us now into Kula's, he's now exposed.
He's exposed. So not quite yet. At
Okay.
first, OSI wanted to make sure that they had the right guy. You know, they were not really interested in tallying courtroom wins. They were trying to make sure that these were real measures of justice, and that in the courtroom that these were ways also to document the history of the Holocaust. There were a few months that go by as they're building this case, and in the summer of 1982, they call Kula in for a meeting in downtown Chicago at the Midland Hotel. And Bruce Einhorn, who's the lead investigator on the case, and Peter Black, who's a historian assigned to the case, both longtime OSI employees, they question Kula, and Kula, he very openly says, "I'm sorry I lied on my visa."
Oh, okay.
Right. And he brings a picture of himself in his Nazi uniform. It's the picture that forms half of the book cover. And he says, I brought this to show you, which is an odd way to defend yourself, right? When you're being accused of being a Nazi, to be like, well, actually, yeah, here's a picture of me in my SS uniform. So they file an order to show cause and initiate deportation proceedings in the following December, so in 1982. It largely goes unremarked in town. He continues working. The superintendent calls him in and says, "Hey man, what is this?" And he says, "Yeah, I was in the SS, but I didn't do anything wrong." He tells a lot of people, "I did no wrong. I killed nobody," which is not the case. And so it largely is unremarked. His deportation trial doesn't start until August of '83. The only time that his name is mentioned in either the school board notes, right, or anything like that, is he actually gets a raise at the end of the 1982-83 school year. So a few months before his deportation trial starts, but a few months after his Nazi past has been revealed, he gets a nice 8.5% pay bump. But it's largely unremarked until the trial starts.
So let me ask you, when he's taken to this hotel to be questioned.
Yeah.
From that point, by the way, I have to say your book reads a little like a thriller. Like, I'm a great reader of lots of particularly Nazi era, spy thrillers, and this has, reads a bit like that, which is really
Thank you.
a compliment to your writing.
Thank you.
So in that period after he has, okay, I mean, he's admitted, it's an amazing story. He shows the picture.
Yeah.
How would people in Oak Park, you said, so his employer knew, the superintendent of schools. Beyond that, how would Oak Park residents, parents of the children in the school, how would they know this? Or was it sort of under the radar?
Yeah, it was reported in the local newspapers.
Okay.
We at the time, Oak Park had two local newspapers. I say we. I grew up in Oak Park. I taught for a long time at this school. So there's two local newspapers, and they report a little bit about it, and you could follow it in the news, but it's not a point of local discourse yet. It will be when the trial starts. But it's kind of not a major focal point of conversation or of interest.
Okay. So let's go to the trial, and then I want to get us to really what's the heart of the story is the reactions of your Oak Park fellow citizens. Are you Oak Parkians?
Yeah, dupers, dear old Oak Parkers is the term.
Okay, great. So just let's give a quick précis of the trial. Where was it held? How long did it last?
Yeah, so it's at the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. The folks who worked at OSI joked we had so many Nazis here that they could have ignored the rest of the country and kept busy. Chicago was the central hub, right? Which makes sense given post-war immigration trends that Eastern European immigrants would have come here. And so the trial starts. OSI's process was to prove with historical documents, and so they have Dr. Charles Sidner come on to testify, and he's an expert on the SS Death's Head Division, the Totenkopf in which Kula served. And they show very clearly that Kula was there. He is promoted multiple times. They have pay stubs. So they demonstrate that he was there. They also demonstrate that Gross-Rosen was a place of persecution, which was the legal standard from the Holtzman Amendment. And they also demonstrate very clearly that he lied on his visa. They bring in four survivors from Gross Rosen to testify, in large part because they are aware that in all of these cases, the accused is a senior citizen, and it would not be unnatural for a judge to empathize with the old man sitting there. And they wanted to ensure that the judge had a more appropriate vessel for that empathy. And so, you know, the survivors, this is also an opportunity to document their experience, to document the Holocaust. And, you know, there had been little written about Gross Rosen. This case helps establish, for Americans in English at least, some of the historical record about it. On the other side, kind of after a hiatus, Kula's defense largely presents the case that he's a good man now. So Kula claims that you know, he never saw prisoners. He also claims in court that he sometimes saw prisoners and gave them presents. His grandson testifies, his daughter-in-law testifies, and three colleagues from Oak Park High all testify about what a great custodian he and man he is at the time at the high school.
Okay, so the finding in the trial.
So, I'm sorry?
The end of the trial, what's the decision?
So it takes a year. And so there's two things happening at the same time. There's the deportation trial, and then gradually, because of two really heroic powerhouses, these two women in Oak Park, there's a secondary trial in town. But the deportation trial will find in the fall of '84, so a full year later, very easily, this is an easy case. It's one of the biggest slam dunks OSI had, that he lied on his visa and he's deportable. Over the next 3 years, Kula will file, basically, he'll exhaust every possible option to kind of appeal, and he'll lose miserably at each time. And he was deported in 1987.
Okay. Okay, great. So now the heart of the story, and in a way, the moral core here.
Yeah.
Okay. Reactions, the spectrum of reactions, and then, you know, once you've sort of charted them out, we want to talk about, in a way, the takeaway from those reactions.
Yeah. So on the second morning of the trial, Raylan Toporov, who was a mom in Oak Park, reads in the newspaper that you know, a Nazi is on trial, and she thinks, good, right? They got another one of these guys. And then she realizes that it says Oak Park and that it's the high school for her children. She runs to her friend's house, Rima Lunin Schultz. Rima will become kind of a preeminent historian of Jane Addams and Chicago women's history. And they start attending the trial. And at home, they start advocating that he should be placed on paid administrative leave. And this is, I think, a really interesting thing. They're not actually advocating for him to be fired or placed on unpaid leave. They're just saying he should be removed from the school. And that the school has not just a moral responsibility, but a pedagogical responsibility. One teacher in the school makes the argument that we're telling kids all the time, every day, what you do when you're 15 and 16 matters. How can we let him stay and say that? Because then we'd be saying what you do at 19 and 20 doesn't. And so we have a pedagogical responsibility. Their advocacy is met with a really harsh resistance in town. And to kind of mention, Oak Park was on the cusp of some significant political changes. It had been founded as this very conservative religious town. It was kind of colloquial known as Saints Rest. You knew you had gotten to Oak Park when the bars stopped and the churches began. But they had, in the kind of post-war years, as integration is kind of pushing in Chicago, Oak Park decides to have a managed limited plan for racial integration. And this becomes over the 70s and into the 80s, this becomes a real core part of the Oak Park identity. Won a national award for its commitment to inclusion in 1976. It was the All-American City. And a neo-Nazi rally in 1980 was shouted down by 3 generations of Oak Parkers, an offshoot of the group who tried to march in Skokie in that pretty famous case. And so this was a town that Rima and Raylan thought it should have been different. If there was one town that was going to be different, right? This should be it. Oak Parkers rally behind Kula. They raise money for his legal defense. They do everything they can to support him, and their support follows a pattern that was actually pretty clearly the pattern in all of these cases. Friends and neighbors and colleagues would at first deny the allegations. There's no way he could have done it. then it becomes clear he's really guilty, right? Like he handed in a picture of himself in an SS uniform. He's not even denying that. So then they downplay. And so they say, well, he was only on the perimeter. He was only 19. How could he have known better? He must have been forced to do it. None of which is true. He oversaw slave labor. He was 19 and 20 and 21 and more. We don't always make the best decisions, but we can know not to participate in working in a concentration camp for 3 years. It's not a huge ask. Nothing would have happened if he had declined the transfer, right? So deny, downplay, and eventually they come to argue the more moral response is forgiveness. And so this is this kind of triarchic pattern that will emerge in all of these cases, and was the case very much in Oak Park as well.
Okay. And were there any ideological defenses of him?
Yeah. And so he's not the first of the Nazis that are caught in the United States. The kind of initial wave of support for Nazis largely came from emigre communities who are worried with the Cold War and these Cold War exigencies of how, as captive nations under Soviet control, how accusations that one of their brethren committed Nazi atrocities might affect public support for for Lithuania or for Latvia, right? In Chicago, it's Lithuania. Out east, it's Latvia. Then that is funneled through white nationalist groups, Willis Carto and the Liberty Lobby, and some of these other kind of right-wing, anti-Semitic white nationalist groups. There's actually a connection between some of these groups and Dr. King's assassin. There's some financial links, right? So you can kind of get a sense of the kind of people we're talking about. They're also, like, Willis Carto is really involved in forming some Holocaust denial groups. And then there is some of that. Oak Park, people are smart enough not to say that publicly, although there are instances where that comes out. And one of the things that's fascinating is how quickly anti-Semitic rhetoric emerges. And so when people are arguing that forgiveness is the more moral response, it's often juxtaposed with the sense of Jewish vengeance.
Right.
And as if putting a Nazi on paid leave from a public high school is vengeful. And so you can see anti-Semitic tropes emerge. Kula's son writes a vitriolic note to the local newspaper saying every other minority group has dealt with difficult things. Blacks have gotten over it. Native Americans have gotten over it. Why can't you Jews give the Holocaust a rest? And he even says, the folks of color and Native Americans have dealt with these things without even controlling the media the way the Jews do. And so you can see these kinds of ideological and anti-Semitic issues come up. They're a little less pervasive in Oak Park, given kind of what the suburb was, but pretty pervasive in the national discourse.
And how do the Jews of Oak Park respond?
Not thrilled. And so it becomes a real rallying point. The synagogues, there's a reform and a conservative synagogue in the town. Both of the rabbis are speaking out. The lay leadership, Rima and Ray Lynn, are really kind of at the forefront. And many of the people who come to join them, and they are a minority in the town, the people who oppose Kula, they are disproportionately Jewish. And the Jewish community was really clear this guy can't be here. I'm sure there's one or two Jews who are on the other side for various reasons, but for the most part, the Jewish community is outraged and feels he's got to go immediately.
And how vociferous or how public are they were they in making that point?
So they're writing letters to the local newspapers. That's where a lot of the discourse was, right? So this is 1983, and so this is the local newspapers are kind of what I tell my students what a Twitter thread used to be, right? That this is where the discourse was able to happen, and they're attending school board meetings and trying to speak. One difficulty is that the school board said this is a personnel matter. And no discussion of a member of the personnel can be, his name can't be mentioned in open session, which really complicates their efforts to advocate against him.
Okay. So he is eventually deported.
He's eventually deported. Yeah. 3 years later.
Okay, so now I want to put you in the picture.
Sure.
How did you find this topic? I mean, that's in some ways
Yeah.
that people like to ask historians, how did you find this? Why did you get started on this?
Yeah, so I grew up in Oak Park, and I was always aware of the story, right? Oak Park, we love our history, and it's a really incredible history. We have, Percy Julian, and Ray Kroc, who founded McDonald's, Ernest Hemingway, who
Right.
wasn't thrilled with the town, but Frank Lloyd Wright's Home and Studio, right? So the Oak Parkers, we have this, we love our history, and so it was always described to me as this quirk, like, oh yeah, we had the voice of Homer Simpson, also a Nazi camp guard, worked at the school. And I always found that really disquieting that it was described as this quirk. In the fall of 2020, I had started teaching a Holocaust studies class. It was I started it in response to kind of a slew of anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes on the high school's campus. And if you remember the fall of 2020, it was not an ideal time to be teaching high school, and
No.
we were on Zoom just like this. And so I had these wonderful kids who had signed up to take this new class, and we're starting every day talking about the Holocaust. And I wanted to find ways to make it impactful pedagogically for them. But there were limits, right? Because we were on Zoom and we were meeting twice a week instead of every day. And so I tried to make the class about stories. So I wove in the stories of some victims, a Jewish family from Poland, which my students found out at the end was my wife's family, my wife's grandparents. Her grandmother had actually, it turns out, been a prisoner briefly at Gross Rosen when Kula was there, which we found out kind of as this was going on.
Huh.
And I started looking into the Kula case, thinking, what an interesting juxtaposition. I have, Polish Jews and this Nazi, some of whom all end up in Chicago. And so there's these personal connections. And I thought, what an interesting kind of teaching thing. And my students kept saying, I don't care about this guy's Nazi past. Why did the town support him? Like, Nazis are Nazis. He's not that interesting. Why did our town rally behind him? It should have taken all of 5 minutes to fire him. And so I started looking for guest speakers who had lived through this to come in and say, here's what we experienced. And as I was interviewing them and talking to them to vet them before I put them in front of children, everybody was so still visceral, right? Like, here we were 40 years later, then it still mattered. I mean, people were crying on the phone and yelling. One school board member who was Jewish said that it felt like a battle zone. And the first phone call I had with it was with a member of the school board who said that in a closed private session, he had asked Kula at the end of all this, did you kill anyone? And Kula says, I don't recall. And it was kind of at that point I said, okay, this is like fascinating. And I, went downstairs and I told my wife, and she said, so are you going to write a book? Right. And I said, no, of course not. I'm not going to write a book. I'm just looking for a guest speaker. But she was right. And so the story really came out of the teaching and these inquisitive students who were kind of demanding that saying, your answer to our question isn't good enough. Why were people rallying behind this guy?
Okay, which, in a way is always my question in the same, because it's obviously really disturbing that that would be the reaction. And he wasn't being it wasn't a matter of executing him. It was just paid leave. It's pretty benign kind of action. So did the students write papers on this? What kind of assignments did you give them?
Yeah, so we simulated the school board meetings. And so
Okay, wow.
I created a several day long simulation of the school board meetings. And so kids, and this was how I started the class after the first year, that the kids would walk in and they didn't know the story, but I would kind of have them go through the simulation and they would find out information about Kula as it became public, like in the order that it happened in the town. And then we would finish the semester. They simulated a Nazi hunt themselves. They started with a phone book, and it's 2023, right? I had to explain to them what that
What's
was.
a phone book?
Yeah, and why you would need to use it. And so they're learning all sorts of things. But they would do that and then kind of go through a list of guards at Dachau, and they found this Nazi who lived in the Portage Park neighborhood here in Chicago named Konrad Chalong, and then they would build a deportation case against him. And so that was kind of how when I taught the Holocaust studies class, how I bookended the course.
Were you able to share with them any of the records, for example, like the family's dishonest statement upon looking for admission to the United States?
Yeah. So I had all of that, and I kept multiple copies of it. I'd gotten his personnel file, and I kept multiple copies of it in my classroom. And kids just kind of knew where it was, and it was like a thing. If you finished what we were working on, kids would go rifle through his personnel file and read what people said. And there's so many people in Oak Park stay in Oak Park for so long that they said, "Oh, this was my mom's English teacher that's supporting it," and all that. And so it was really interesting to kind of investigate this kind of personal connection to him.
How did you get the personnel files? I would imagine those would be uh, quite unavailable to researchers.
You just have to FOIA.
Okay.
As public school employees, our personnel files are public record. So some of it was redacted, but the woman who worked in the board office, I'll give her Gail Calmerton, was wonderful and super helpful as I was kind of initiating the research on the school end with that and the school board notes and closed board session notes. She was really helpful in procuring those documents.
Okay, I mean, it's really quite a story. So how did you find the time to write it, given you probably were teaching 4 or 5 classes a semester?
Yeah. We'd get our kids to bed at 7 or so, and I'd try and research and write for a few hours. I made good use of early mornings, and in the summer, walk the kids over to their day camp and sprawl out Nazi documents on the dining room table, and clean them up, at 3:15 before they got home. It was, because you've done significantly more than just one of these. It was really, really, really engaging, and I was thinking about it all the time. I would find myself lost in outlining in my head. When you're passionate about a topic and feel like there's a story that really needs to be told, you find ways to make time. And I should say that was largely enabled by my wife, who saw the importance of this story, right? Descends from survivors and victims of the Holocaust, and she really made sure that this was a family project that we were able to kind of find the time to make sure could come to fruition.
What about your in-laws? Were they
Wonderful. Yeah, so they
they had this connection to
yeah. I mean, I shared drafts with them and talked through things. A lot of our family, the kind of grandparent generation, are academics, which was very helpful as well, in terms of talking through the process of a book proposal, and several of them did helped a lot too with copy edits and
nice.
drafts. My father did the indexing, so it was a family affair, but I think it was very personal. On my side, this was the town that we had lived in growing up. And on my wife's side, like, there was this very close connection to the Holocaust itself and to the victims of the camp that Kula had worked at, and so it felt and is very personal to our family.
Okay, so you've used the word passion and you've talked about sense of responsibility to get this done. So what, as we begin sort of wrapping up, because we want to have 4 or 5 minutes from now, the beginnings of questions from the audience. What do you see as the takeaway or multiple takeaways from this? What is the lesson that this offers about American reaction to the Holocaust, to maybe human nature, maybe to other morally fraught situations?
Sure. So I think it's important, first of all, to document the past, right? Whether we're drawing a moral lesson or not, right? This was a historical question and part of the historical record that hadn't been fully answered, and I hope that this contributes to our understanding of of the kind of history of perceptions of the Holocaust. I think that the book lands also in an understanding of anti-Semitism, that sometimes it manifests in really obvious ways with, swastikas and Jews will not replace us and firebombing synagogues. And sometimes anti-Semitism looks like a lack of empathy for Jewish pain. And I think that was the case here. I think that you've written obviously about Holocaust memory and Holocaust understanding, and I think that outside of Jewish communities, the Holocaust education was really lagging, and I think some of what was happening was a misperception and a misunderstanding here of the Holocaust. But I think that there's this larger human thing that was at play as well. That the folks who were defending Kula were maybe not defending him entirely, but they were finding out that these were people who saw themselves as good people, and they found out that they were friends with the monster. And at some point, you have to kind of just rectify those two competing ideas. And either he is a monster and you can't be friends with him anymore, or you have to justify your friendship by saying he's not actually the monster. And so I think there's a lot of moral self-justification. I think it's important to note that it often veered into anti-Semitic tropes, because that was just there in the ether. But largely, I think on a historical note, I think it's important to know that the efforts to bring Nazis to justice were often fraught with controversy, and I think that it really really helps us understand that our narrative of World War II and of the Holocaust and of America's response is perhaps a lot rosier than it should be.
Okay. What kind of reactions have you gotten so far to the book?
It's been really largely positive, which has been a relief.
Wonderful.
Yeah, my students have been really kind of wonderful and eager, and have gotten it, have asked me to sign it for their
I
parents.
say really proud.
It's really nice. I think it's helped as as I'm teaching writing, I think I have a little bit more credibility when I tell them their topic sentence is a little more nuanced. And so, that's been good. The reception seems to have been, it's a crazy story. And so, it's been fun to get to talk about it. And so people have found the story, I think, pretty interesting.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up, and we're gonna Sydney, I believe, is going to be the veteran of the questions or the asker. But I just really want to end again by saying not only was it just so well written and so gripping, and there are times I was reading it kind of like I read a novel, just like because I was just really captivated by the flow of the narrative, but it really is a challenging issue. And you kind of look around, well, what about my neighbor? What about my neighbor? What about this person who I have no reason to think had ever done anything of a evil nature? And really amazing story and about the workings of the government and everything. So really, thank you for your
Thank
work.
you.
And now I'm
Thank you.
going to turn it to Sydney.
I want to thank you both before we get into audience questions for this really amazing conversation, and thank you both for taking the time. It was really I learned a lot from watching you both. So I'm going to start with an easy question that's just a clarification. Can you clarify what was the lie on Kula's visa?
Yeah, so he does not list that he's in the SS, and so members of the SS were legally excluded from entry, and so he knew to just say that he was in the army, and he leaves out that he was in the SS, and it was required. They were in an interview. He would have been explicitly asked, "Were you in the SS?" And so he clearly said no.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. So you said that Kula didn't change his name, I believe. So do you know if Nazi hunters were able to find Nazis who did change their names? And if so, what was the strategy to do that?
Yeah, so there was one, actually, the highest ranking Nazi who enters the United States is Andrija Artakovic, who is the interior minister of the independent state of Croatia. the Nazi puppet state. And he was actually in charge of implementing Nazi racial laws and the concentration camp system, which existed in brutal fashion there. He comes in under false pretenses, claiming his name is Alwa Anik, and very quickly then goes back to living under his real name. The truth is, most of them came and lived under their real name. There were surely instances where people kind of used a false name or things like that, but for the most part, the Nazis who came here didn't. They used their real name, and I think it suggests that perhaps they didn't think they did anything wrong.
Mhm.
Thank you. And so another question that came in is asking, why would Kula and I think Nazis more generally come to the US as opposed to either like staying in their native country or maybe going somewhere else? What was yeah.
Yeah, many of them do stay in Germany, and that would have been a great way to never be brought to justice.
Right.
Germany's legal code required a specific crime against a specific victim that was provable. By 1981, Justice Thurgood Marshall had ruled here that simply working at a camp was an inherently criminal act, and so we didn't need to have that kind of personal right. And the reasoning was, if you work at Ford and somebody asks you what you do, you say, I make cars. Well, if you work at Treblinka, right, you participate in murder. Some did stay in Germany. Some obviously flee to South America. We know that's kind of a traditional rat line, but they were in their 30s. They were with families, and the post-war economy was stronger here than it was in Germany, and they came like any other immigrant, just the American dream, and they're hoping for a better economic situation for their kids.
Thank you. So also it seemed kind of from your discussion here that it was pretty clear that Kula was who he was, and it was probably he was going to be charged eventually. So why did he bother to fight the charge at all if it seemed pretty clear cut?
Yeah, this was one of the first questions that I asked when I was interviewing folks from OSI. That asking like why? Like they're so obviously guilty. And so what the response was from the folks who prosecuted these cases was this was a way to try and prove to their friends, to try and make a say to their friends, I'm innocent. This is the government who is going against me. It's a witch hunt. Particularly folks who came from Soviet-occupied countries made a big show of saying that it was the OSI was a KGB, setup, and all these kind of crazy things, right? As there's pictures of them at Treblinka, right? But part of it was a way to kind of defend to their friends and say, no, I'm okay. And part of it was the longer that you appealed, the longer that you stayed in the country and could continue working or being with your grandkids. They didn't want to go. And particularly if they were at risk, Kula was German, but if they were at risk of being sent to the Soviet Union, they were sure to be executed. And so they had every reason to exhaust the appellate system here.
And in the sort of sympathy that he got from some members of the Oak Park community, do you think there was anti-Semitism that played any role in that?
100%. I think that to defend a Nazi, right? It's there's a lot there that there at the minimum there was a lack of empathy for Jewish pain. Now I will say there was at least one member of the faculty who said, I totally understand why the Jewish community wants this guy gone. And if the court comes back and says that he lied on his visa, he should be deported. And as a school, we need to wait out the legal process. And so there's this like due process issue too. There was also at least one member of the faculty who that teacher would not work with because he knew her to be motivated explicitly by kind of pro-Nazi sentiment or by anti-Semitism. So that's absolutely there. And there's one letter to the newspaper from a prominent Oak Parker, complains about the Jewish women who are saying Kula should be removed and says, don't you know that the presumption of innocence is the only thing keeping you from the gas ovens, which is a wild thing to say to a Jewish woman, especially because Kula didn't deserve the presumption of innocence. He had already admitted to having been a Nazi. The trial is not whether he was a Nazi or had participated in Nazi atrocities. It was whether he had lied on a form. Right? It's a very kind of different thing. So yeah, anti-Semitism is absolutely a factor there. and the national discourse, absolutely.
That's kind of astounding to hear that somebody would say that. But yeah,
And
thank you.
wrote it with his name on it, signed his name at the bottom, right?
Like,
Yeah.
okay, so a lot of people also are asking what happened to Kula after he was deported.
Very little. He just kind of lives out his days. So he gets back to Germany in 1987. Very quickly, the German prosecutor for war crimes says we don't have anything we can bring him to trial for, and so we will not be pressing charges. We've been. It's funny. After the book came out, a researcher in Germany reached out and said, I'd love to work with you and see if we can track down more about his life here. We haven't been able to find much. He was retired. His wife eventually joins him. His children, his son and his daughter, both stay here, and his grandkids did as well. And he continued receiving his pension from the Illinois Metropolitan Retirement Fund through 2006 when he passed away.
Gotcha, thank you. And what happened to his family at all? His family that was here?
Yeah, I mean they remained here. So the Office of Special Investigations was not interested in anyone who lied on their visa. They were interested in anyone who lied on their visa to cover up their participation in the Holocaust. And so his wife theoretically, I guess, right, was in on the lie. She's not deported. She eventually moves back to Germany with him. That you can read in the book. There's some maneuverings from the school that protect his and her financial interests. The children stay here. They raise families in the same area in the near western suburbs of Chicago. The son died. He had complications from Crohn's, I believe, in the mid 1990s. His daughter died about 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago. The grandkids are here. I think his daughter-in-law is still here. So the family's still around in the area.
And did his family face any backlash after he was deported?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I understood. I reached out a couple times. They were obviously not interested in interviewing. That would have been a question that I would have loved to ask. My understanding, nothing explicit. His son did. Jews received backlash from his family, I should note. His son had written a virulently anti-Semitic letter that I mentioned earlier. But no, I think people understand that there's, it's natural to love your grandfather or your father-in-law and or your dad and to stand up for him. Those in the trials, even when, as they're testifying, there's very little, if any, cross-examination. You kind of understand where they're coming from. So no, they don't really face much backlash.
Thank you. And we also have some questions about the curriculum that you talked about, which sounded really interesting. Has that evolved at all since 2020 and since your book came out at all?
So yeah, I mean, I'm not teaching the Holocaust studies class. Someone else is. I'm in a different district right now. But yeah, that curriculum, I know the teacher, I'm in touch with her a lot. She's using a lot of it, and over time, as I was learning more, I added things or changed things in the curriculum, and had more documentation as I would do archival work on Kula that I could bring to kids. And as I was writing the book, I was kind of sharing ideas with kids in the Holocaust studies class, and it was a really kind of interesting thing to be able to show them. Right, I had his SS file, and so we're learning about how the Nazis would train SS men to be good dads because they had to pass on their Aryan genes for this racially pure. And I said, like, look, here's the family tree he submitted when he got married, proving there were no Jews and nobody with disabilities, right? And so we could use that in class, which is a really kind of powerful educational tool.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting thing, and I think it would have been really cool to do that when I was in high school as well. So, another question that a lot of people are asking is, you talked a little bit about your students' reaction and how proud they are of you, very justly, through the book. But sort of what is the wider reaction in Oak Park, and has anything changed, and what's like the local conversation about the case now? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's funny. It very quickly after Kula after Kula's deportation, it very quickly recedes. And so two of the teachers who were largely involved on kind of opposite sides, and like 95% of the faculty supported him. And then, two Jewish teachers didn't. But the two of the teachers, they would go into classrooms sometimes together and talk. And so they would share with students throughout the 90s that. But the case really receded from the larger public discourse pretty quickly in the town. But in 2012, and this serves as the book's epilogue, this eighth grader at a Catholic school, African American eighth grader, is interested for the history fair project that she's doing. Her brother had done this award-winning piece on the Chicago Defender, our Black newspaper, and she wanted to best him, and she built this incredible project where it was supposed to be the janitorial closet. So on the outside, it's all these Oak Park things, and then inside, it's documents from Gross Rosen, right? And there was a light that you could turn on and see if you wanted to. And she was trying to highlight the idea that these were buried deep inside, but they were visible if you wanted to know. A really, really incredible project, especially from this eighth grader. And to my great sadness, she did not go on to be a historian, though. I think that Drew Johnson, wonderful, wonderful mind. She got a lot of backlash in the community in 2012. Why won't you leave this man alone? What did he do to you? And they're yelling at she's a grown up now, but she was a kid, and got this visceral reaction. And when I started researching the case, I got a little bit of that too. Somebody said, the real problem was you Jews and your self-righteousness. And somebody else said, I hope you don't make him look bad, right? And I was thinking, like, this is an admitted Nazi. What would I do that makes it worse than when he said, yes, I worked at Gross Rosen, right? So there was one or two other kind of vaguely threatening notes that I received. So there is that, but I think, it's a long time now. Oak Park is a much, much, much different place even than it was in the 80s. And so, I think that the case is perceived less controversially now than it was. I guess it wasn't that controversial in some ways, but he would receive much less support now in the community.
Yeah, that's just again so shocking to hear how strongly people reacted to that. So we are reaching the end of our time, but I don't know if either you, Mike, or Hasia have any kind of parting words for us before we wrap up.
Only a thank you again to Mike for having made this material available to not just me, but to the reading public, and fantastic.
Thank you for having me, and Professor Diner. What a joy it is to get to be in conversation with you.
Likewise.
And again, I want to thank you both for being here and for doing this conversation with us, and for taking the time to share this story with us. And for those of you who are joining us out in the internet verse, I highly suggest that you buy Our Nazi, which you can do at the link in the chat. And if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. You can watch past programs and view and share today's recordings, the recording of today's program, which is going to be available later this week on the museum's YouTube channel. Mike, Hasia, thank you so much again. It's always a pleasure. Have a great night, and we'll see you all soon.
Okay, Doug, thank you.
Bye.